Welcome to Tritiyo Matra. This is the last of a series of 4 talk shows concerning the upcoming Summit for Democracy and to facilitate discourse regarding the state of democracy in South Asia. The first 3 shows focused on the 3 themes of the summit. The first show focused on the theme of defending against authoritarianism. The second show focused on advancing respect for human rights, and the third focused on fighting and addressing corruption. In today's show, we hope to take stock of the previous discussions and delve deeper into an analysis of the current state of democracy in South Asia. We hope to identify challenges faced by each country represented on the panel, opportunities that there are in supporting democracy in the region, and the role that the private sector, civil society, think tanks, media, academia, and international organizations can play in the process of propagating democracy and rule of law in the region. To discuss these imperative issues, it is my pleasure to introduce our esteemed guests for today, Dr. Ali Riaz, non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and distinguished professor, Illinois State University, USA, Mr. Nishan De Mel, executive director, Verite Research, Sri Lanka, Akash Shrestha, Mr. Akash Shrestha, research manager, Samriddhi Foundation, Nepal, Dr. Vaqar Ahmed, joint executive director, Sustainable Development Policy Institute, Pakistan, and Ms. Aarya Nijat, program officer, Asian Pacific Center for International Private Enterprise, CIPE, USA. Dr. Riaz, Mr. Nishan, Dr. Akash, Dr. Vaqar, and Ms. Aarya, welcome to the show. My first question is for the 4 panelists from South Asia. What is your assessment of the state of democracy in the country that you represent and in the broader South Asia? What specific 2-3 challenges does democracy face in this region? We'll begin with Dr. Riaz and followed by Nishan, Dr. Vaqar, and then Akash. You have 2 minutes, Dr. Riaz.
Thank you, Zalur. As you can understand and as you have prefaced in our other programs as well, that the democracy situation in South Asia is absolutely not good. It has been experienced a major democratic backsliding. We have seen in case of the largest of the countries, India. But most importantly, I understand that you would like me to focus on Bangladesh. The Bangladesh situation that we know in a recent report published by IDEA, that is International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, Bangladesh has been described as an authoritarian. Freedom House has described it as partly free. Over the last 10 years, almost for a decade, definitely for the last 7 years, what we are witnessing is that institutions have become ineffective as a guardrail against authoritarianism. Increasingly, it is sliding towards, and as if I take ideas, point, it has become an authoritarian government. The freedom of expression is restricted. Now, the point is, where do we go from here? And most importantly, the role that civil society can play. In any case, in any situation, authoritarian regimes tend to decimate the civil society, but there are scopes for the private sector, there are scopes for think tank and media. Despite restrictions, I think these organizations, these sectors to be precise, have significant role to play in pushing back. We haven't seen it yet, but I think that the think tanks and the media has to take a step. And particularly, I'm expecting that the civil society in general, with the cooperation of the private sector, will be able to make sure that the further sliding can be stopped and it can be reversed. What can be done with respect to the reversing the trend? The first and foremost is establishing the rights of the people for a free and fair election. That is, in case of Bangladesh, is absolutely necessary, and whatever steps needs to be done, needs to be done. Second is the media's independence needs to be restored. The pressure on media needs to be lifted, particularly Digital Security Act should go away. And the final point is establishing the right to assembly. That has been curtailed so much so that hardly any opposition could, in last 7 years, had a major demonstration in Bangladesh. So I will stop there, and I hope that these are the steps that will be taken or at least considered by the civil society, private sector, media, and others to reverse the course that we are witnessing of authoritarian sliding of Bangladesh?
Thank you, Dr. Riaz. Mr. Nishan De Mel.
Thank you, Zilur, for inviting me on this program. Great pleasure to be with you all. I think it's a very important question, and I will begin by highlighting two negative trends for democracy and end by talking about a positive aspect of democracy in South Asia also. I think what you see over time is that there is an increasing sense of disillusionment in Sri Lanka, and I think it reflects on South Asia as well, with democratic institutions being able to deliver on the aspirations that people have. This is mainly driven by the fact that we have structures of democracy in parliament, in judiciaries, in police, in even human rights commissions. But often the way in which these structures function don't actually live up to the hope that people have placed on them in terms of equality, in terms of dignity, in terms of agency, and in terms of honoring the values that these structures are meant to uphold. So briefly, I think that this is a deepening cycle of disillusionment and the tendency, I think, that Dr. Riaz pointed out towards authoritarianism or supporting authoritarian-like leaders can arise out of this kind of disillusionment with the way that promised institutions of democracy are delivering or not delivering. And I think that is a matter of concern that we need to look at carefully in South Asia. Secondly, I think what you also see is the increasing hegemonistic instrumentalization of polarization, social polarization for electoral competition. You see the Hindutva movements in India, you see the Sinhala Buddhist movements in Sri Lanka. And for the first time in Sri Lanka's history, the last election was won by a party and the president that explicitly campaigned on the basis of Sinhala Buddhist authoritarianism, rather than trying to converge towards a democratic middle. So I think that is something we see the world over, but also a long tradition of South Asian diversity getting instrumentalized in the electoral process itself to drive social polarization and to leverage electoral victory through driving social polarization, which is obviously a problematic trend as well. Now, I want to just end by citing something that I see also as very positive in South Asia, that people really find elections to be a legitimizing factor. So even authoritarian leaders, whether it is in Pakistan or Bangladesh, as Dr. Riaz pointed out, will feel the need to hold regular elections. And in Sri Lanka especially, almost every election has seen a change in government or leaders over a very long period of time. So there is a sense of resilience that society does not accept. Even leaders that are elected to be strongmen because there's distrust in institutions, when they fail to deliver on the expectations that people have for justice, for fairness, for equality, for dignity. And I think this is a very important positive side of South Asian society as well.
Thank you.
Which we must take into consideration.
Thank you, Nishan. Dr. Vaqar Ahmed, it's your turn.
Thank you very much. I think the transition towards a transparent democratic system in Pakistan, it's been slow. However, I think during the past 3 terms, we have seen successful transition between 3 different political parties. One of the problems that traditionally Pakistan used to face was with regards to civil-military relations, which under the current party seem to have been less of a concern, given that they do enjoy decent relations. However, we've often seen that civil-military relations get tested once the situation in the region is turbulent, which is now the case that we are seeing in the form of Afghanistan, for example, and the situation which is evolving in Pakistan, which could easily test the civil military relations in Pakistan as well. But having said this, I believe that the three mainstream political parties in Pakistan have stood their ground. They have had their own agendas, fairly thought out manifestos, and the public at large have given all of them the chance. And it is now, of course, up to them to decide that how they can build credibility around their performance. There are, however, two or three problems which these parties still have to address. First is that all the three mainstream parties are still being blamed for lack of democratic values within their own hierarchy. So most would be family-centric clans, and the rise of the average political worker remains rare. Second, one also doesn't see that these political parties have been keen to devolve power to sub-national administrations. So provinces, and then from provinces to districts, and then tehsils. That has been very slow. So the actual value of democracy, which was to give power to really the grassroots people, that's been fairly slow. And I think finally, it's the relationship of these political parties with the civil society organizations. Once these political parties are in opposition, they find these civil society organizations as friends who voice in favor of democracy, democratic values. But the moment these political parties come in power, there's a tendency to see civil society organizations as part of the opposition, as part of the problem, which has in turn resulted in a shrinking space for civil society organizations as a whole.
Thank you, Vaqar. Thank you. Mr. Akash Shrestha.
Thank you. I think from a South Asian perspective, I think we should also acknowledge the fact that, democracy in South Asia is a fairly nascent, practice, in that, our history has been that of fight against colonialism and, that constant struggle to secure national sovereignty against, geopolitical tensions. So based on that background, I think it should be the democratic movement in South Asia should be, looked at based on that background. And since the practice is very new, institutions are very nascent, and there have been, learning curves across the region. I think that is not entirely a bad thing, but we must acknowledge that, overall in the region, in the recent times, we have definitely seen a backsliding of democracy. Coming into my own country, Nepal, here as well, we've only, flirted with democracy for about 2 decades now. And so based on the nascency of democracy here in Nepal as well, I would say that on a year-on-year basis, Nepal has been doing good, but also in isolation. If you look at our country in isolation, then I would have to say that we've not been doing enough. And what I mean by that is, for example, we have drafted new constitutions and, secured rights through the constitution, but their enforcement is still, a far, shot. And, we have, through the constitution, also gone into being a federal democratic republic, but, the autonomy of subnational governments is, again, very questionable. I think, the entire branches of the government are currently in shambles. For example, the parliament, the session of the House was, it ended amidst, opposition from a singular party since the start of the House in September. And, against the backdrop of pandemic, people had a lot of expectations from the government about reforms that would help rebuild the economy, but the only major thing it could do was, pass an updated budget, and nothing else could be discussed. The executive has been on the news for all the wrong reasons, coming up with and repealing ordinances at whim and, in a way that suits the government or the particular political party. in power, in judiciary too. I mean, recent days, the politicization of judiciary has been laid bare when, the news of the Chief Justice, bargaining with the government for key, portfolios in the government surfaced. The judiciary has been in a state of deadlock because of the confrontation between the judges and the Chief Justice. So, all in all branches of the government are in shambles, and, people are beginning to question, the notion of democracy. And I think that's very dangerous. Also, since we are a new federal democratic republic, whatever happens in the region affects us, and, the rise of authoritarianism or the polarization, or the populism that is happening in around the region definitely affects us as well, especially the new institutions of ours that are yet to mature. Another maybe challenge to democracy in Nepal would be, or maybe in the region itself, could be, the entanglement between politics and bureaucracy. What I mean by that is, in the United States, regardless of, what new, president comes in, I mean, the functions of the bureaucracy does not, get affected. I mean, generally get affected to a very large extent. But here, with every change in government, with new incoming ministers, it directly affects public service delivery, and, the bureaucracy gets really entangled in the politics. And I think finally, another major challenge in the region itself is, the leadership and I think search for a young generation of leaders in politics.
Thanks, Doc. Akash, Aarya Nijat, what's CIPE's approach to democracy assistance programs in this region, and given the challenges described by other panelists? Aarya.
Thank you, Zalor, for your question and for having me. I would be happy to talk about CIPE's approach to program development, which I think makes an earnest attempt at responding to the kind of immense challenges that was just described by my co-panelists. And I would list a few elements to make it easy to remember. The first element of CIPE's program approach is having a long-term lens to program development and partnerships, which is basically informed by a humbling understanding that democratization is a lengthy, messy, adaptive process that's unique to each context. And it goes through stages, but not necessarily all in the direction of perfecting a system of democracy at a pace that's unique to that context. A second element of this approach is local ownership. And this too is informed by the above, but also by the importance of contextual dynamics of countries where CIPE operates. Basically, unless and until there's both need and demand for an idea, we do not make assumptions at CIPE about the potential benefits of intervening, no matter how driven and passionate we may feel here in Desi. So when it comes to CIPE's program, ideas have to originate in the field. A third element of this program development approach is being flexible and being open to outliers. And this is based on the understanding that we operate in an uncertain world, as was also reflected in the comments that my co-panelists made. And exactly the possibilities that we may be blinded to could become or define our next reality. So we try to remain flexible, open to course corrections, trying our best to not let administrative processes get in the way of better program implementation, and be okay with not knowing. But be open to learning. And that is the fourth element, CIPE's approach to learning. We have a specific department. I think the director of that department you had on your show a few weeks ago, that's dedicated to policy and program learning. And it has one basic mission, taking stock of program implementation lessons to help inform policy choices, and then inversely putting those policy choices through the test of practice in program implementation. But all of this does not mean that we do not make mistakes or make wrong choices or that we have it all figured out. We don't. But when we don't, we are open about that. I think being aware of our resource absorption capacity, our assets and limitations is really helpful in being transparent about it, particularly. Because in the process of program development, we come across many great program ideas, but not all of them lead to CIPE programs. We admit when something is a great idea, but just not for us. So in a nutshell, we firmly stay away from promises that we cannot keep and words that we cannot stand by, all in the service of credibility. And that brings me to the last point, which I think reflects to Nishan's points on values and disillusionment. CIPE tries to value the humans in the lifetime, however portion of it that they invest in this work. And we keep reminding ourselves that at the end of the tunnel of democracy assistance, if there is such a tunnel, there are humans whose lives get affected by this work and at times may be at stake. So every step needs to be taken with a lot of thought and a lot of care.
Great, thank you, Aarya. And again, my second questions for the four panelists from South Asia focuses on forward-looking ideas. In your opinion and based on your years of program leadership experience, what can be done to support democracy in South Asia and to reverse this trend of democratic backsliding at the country and regional level? And what role can the private sector, civil society, think tanks and academia play in the process? We'll first go to Dr. Vaqar, followed by Akash, Dr. Riaz and Nishan, very briefly and precisely. Dr. Vaqar.
Thank you very much. Our current approach has been three-pronged, actually, in strengthening democratic voices and being part of the solution here. First is that we really see the business voices and the voices of those who can participate in self-employment livelihoods as an interest group, which would be a median group of the population. And they're usually small, medium-sized, which in turn end up providing livelihoods to the largest chunk of labor force in South Asia and Pakistan. And we believe that a more economically independent population could better demand rights and entitlements. Second, our approach is to encourage the self-employed and small and medium-sized firms to engage in cross-border trade and investment value chains, in turn strengthening economic interdependencies. This has been our approach when we have tried to add some bit to Afghanistan-Pakistan relations or India-Pakistan relations, for example, and also at a wider SAARC level as well.
Thank you.
And I think thirdly, we
please make it short, Vaqar, please.
Yeah, please. I think I was just about to say that we end up working with a lot of media professionals to carve out an urgent and compelling case for deeper forms of democracy to take root. Thank you.
Akash.
I think, tangible economic gains are what matter to the people, talking about Nepal's own history, we have seen different kinds of, political systems in the last, 7 decades. We've almost been seeing, one new form of government or one new political system every decade. And, it begs the question as to, why do we see so many changes in the systems? And our answer or our interpretation of that is, despite, regardless of whatever different types of political systems we've tried, however many we've tried, people have not been able to see, tangible economic benefits accruing to themselves as a result of that political system. So I think it's really important to ensure that, that is in place. I think it's important to especially now these days start investing in infrastructures. What I mean by that is we see that the states that are also authoritarian in nature are also the ones that are investing in infrastructures across the region. And as one of the implications of this is that as the authoritarian regimes start supporting the development projects or development programs in these growth hungry countries, the people will grow, people's affinity towards the partner country and the system of governance will only grow. That is also something we should, I think, bear in mind. Grassroots people have, recently started being more and more engaged in politics. They're starting, new discourses at different nooks and crannies of the countries. That is, I think, a very good thing. Talking about civil societies, of late, the government has really been, shrinking the space for the civil societies by making it more and more difficult for them to operate. talking about international community, I think the presence of a big international community really helps with check on the democratic backsliding in Nepal. And, we do expect, more and more of that kind of role. And I think finally, academia, think tanks, their functioning is really, academia especially, their function is really affected by the sheer, shortage of funding that enables them to carry out, researches on, issues of, crucial significance. And, civil societies, think tanks, I think you need to, move away from log frames and deliverables and outcomes. And,
thank you, Akash.
No matter how long it takes, work towards, promoting democracy.
Thank you. Dr. Riaz.
I was speaking normatively rather than, given that compared to my co-panelist, my experience in that case limited of leading. But most important thing that I think is the role of the international communities that you have mentioned. That whether there need to be an assessment as to whether their roles are becoming corrosive. Corrosive in the sense that many instances by prioritizing either the strategic interest or the global dimension of politics, they might actually be contributing to the democratic backsliding. That's why what I think is the most important element is to understand the dynamics that is taking place within this country. People's aspiration and resilience is, beyond any doubt, whether it is in Pakistan, whether it is in India or Bangladesh. I can say it without any hesitation with respect to Bangladesh, that the resilience of the people is there. They would like to have this democracy. They would like to see an inclusive system, both political and economic. However, what we are witnessing is, in many instances, this international support seems to be not taking into account these aspirations rather than the strategic and other interests are prioritized. Hence, looking at the grassroots, their aspirations, their involvement needs to be prioritized, needs to be included in whatever international support. The final point is that there is a global dimension. If you take the example of the previous democratization processes, each and every time that we have seen the large number of countries becoming democratic, say, for example, 1974 onwards, what we have seen is the standard bearer of democracy. Morally, ethically, and in terms of practice, there should be a global leadership. We are seeing the absence of that. In case of a region, India has failed, and India is miserably failed. Previously, the countries used to look up to India, but India is not in that position. It is not in a position to lead this. That is why the international bodies, and particularly the United States, which has its own problems, needs to, take care of its own home, but most importantly, stand up. And that is where I see this Democracy Summit is making a contribution, at least in terms of commitment. Those are the things that we see. And hence, going back to your question, what can be done? Most important thing to me is that each country in the region has its own problems, if I say it, problems, each dynamics, and that needs to be, a cookie cutter solution is not going to work. It has to be tailored, very customized. Say, for example, in case of Bangladesh, the priority should be an inclusive election. How do you make sure? How do you make sure that the frivolous cases against the opposition is not stifling the entire opposition, which it has? Or for that matter, how do you put pressure on the government to reduce the stifling of the media, muzzling the media, or the basic fundamentals? Those are the things that needs to be in any conversation from international community and international bodies, including the United States, should be at the forefront. That's what is missing, seems to me. I'm not saying that is same with Nepal. The Nepal case is different. So that is what needs to be. The final point is that there should not be a plain and simple one thing that holds South Asia is there. Again, given India's vastness and influence, I think India should be considered differently than other countries that we are talking here. And those are the things I expect from the international community. and particularly United States in the coming years after the Democracy Summit?
Thank you. Nishan.
Thank you, Zidul. I think you asked what private sector, academics, civil society, and think tanks can do. I think with regard to the private sector, what Aarya said about patient investment is quite important. The temptation when you see democratic structures being undermined is for the private sector to engage in a kind of patronage-based, crony capitalism, as it were, to maximize the short-term success. But it obviously ends up undermining the longer-term profit and success for the sector, as the structures in which the private sector can succeed are undermining the backsliding aspects of democracy. So it's very important for the private sector to recognize how to think and invest and support even politicians for the longer term, rather than look at the short-term survival and success. And I think that's an important element that has to be brought in. For academia, I think it's important to reach more deeply into the culture of democracy in our own countries. The book Argumentative Indian by Amartya Sen about India, Nelson Mandela's biography tell us that all our cultures have deep-rooted instincts for democracy which are underappreciated, so that people begin to recognize democracy as internal to our societies rather than something that's borrowed from outside. For civil society and think tanks, I think that's a role that think tanks can play as well, but think tanks can also join with civil society, I think, in changing public conversation and public demand for what is important and what is wanted. Now, we say that democracy is government by conversation, but often we try to shore up democracy, not by changing the conversation, but by acting at an elite level to change laws or create institutions. I think laws and institutions that are not held up by public support and public conversation tend not to work very well. So the most important thing is to invest in shaping and changing the public conversation, I think, and that would really help to shore up democracy in our country.
Thank you, Nishan. Aarya, given that you were based at the CIPE headquartered in Washington, D.C., do you observe enthusiasm for supporting democracy in South Asia? How international organizations like CIPE adjusting to the shifting policy dynamics on supporting democracy in the context of recent developments in Afghanistan and the increased emphasis on countering China?
Thank you, Zulor, for that question. I think it has a lot packed in it, but here's what I can say. First of all, I can only speak for CIPE. And as I mentioned, our long-term lens to partnership development ensures that CIPE remains committed to our partners. But since you asked for my observation, I do not sense a drop in enthusiasm for democracy work in any region, including in South Asia. If anything, as far as South Asia is concerned, at least in the past 2 to 3 years, I've noticed an increased interest in smaller South Asian countries, in addition to the usual suspects of India and Pakistan. No offense to Dr. Vaqar. CIPE has had programs across South Asia for many years, but it's quite recent that several DC-based think tanks have begun having regular briefs developed about all countries in South Asia. And to me, that's all indications of increased interest in wanting to learn more about the smaller South Asian countries' preferences and priorities, gather information and share it. And on the second part of your question, I think there's another way of looking at sources of inspiration or anchors of interest in South Asian democracy elsewhere. And I think Nishan alluded to that as well. And that has to do with the dynamic that defines the relation between indigenous aspirations for democracy and external support for it. I noticed in the framing of your question that you used the word support, and I'm glad you chose so because this word in itself carries the definition of the role of international organizations. It indicates a subordinate and secondary role because when support is being provided, there has to be a recipient indeed, a process already in place, an indigenous demand for change running strong, an indigenous realization to the need to do something already there. And so organizations that understand this, I think, and luckily CIPE is one of those, do not need a lot of adjusting to do, even when there may be shifts in policy dynamics or increased emphasis on geopolitics, because their strategies are informed not by external assumptions, but by internal realities and values of the contexts where they operate.
Mr. Akash, Dr. Vaqar Nishan, this question for you three. How has the COVID-19 pandemic affected the state of democracy and rule of law in your respective regions? Just in 1 minute, Mr. Akash.
So I think, in the pretext of the pandemic, the governments, resorted to, curtailing, people's freedom of expression, freedom of movement, and, the governments basically used the pandemic as a scapegoat for, not being able to respond to the popular aspirations and, the lack of accountability. I think all of these point to the fact that, it definitely had a negative bearing on the state of democracy and rule of law. I think, having said that, what validates the significance of federalism in Nepal is that, subnational governments were very proactive. They had limited capacities, but whatever, humble, quarantine facilities they could, build, procurement of medical and non-medical supplies.
Thank you, Akash.
They did all those good things.
I'll stop you.
Yeah, sure.
Please, Dr. Vaqar.
Yes, thank you. I think Pakistan was relatively lucky in terms of the instance of COVID. It was able to come out of the impact, socioeconomic impact, which was earlier anticipated. It was able to sort of stay safe from it. But yes, I'll agree with Akash that here as well, the government was able to use COVID to really look away from many of those painful or urgent reforms which were needed, structural reforms in the economic space which were needed. They were able to put it on the back burner. But this was rather short-lived because now the government understands that there's strong global inflation hitting the balance of payment, and their ability to really manage the economy amid external economic pressures will be tested.
Nishan.
I think, first of all, it created what you call a wartime license, where the government had the license to act as it was acting in times of war, to suspend normal rules, normal checks and balances on the use of power, to roll out the military, to undermine the bureaucracy, and also to function outside the rule of law. I won't go into detail, but it was quite startling how that was possible, and people accepted it because it was effectively a state of emergency. And at the same time, citizens felt they can't complain because the government is fighting a very tough battle, as it were. And the idea of rallying around the flag at times of war, the citizens' silence and support for whatever the government does. And I think both of these undermined, in a way, democratic values as well as democratic practices in the country during the time of COVID-19.
Thank you, Nishan. Dr. Riaz, how effective have multilateral associations such as ASEAN, SAARC, and the BIMSTEC been in aiding the cause of promoting democracy among member nations? Do you think there is more opportunity for organizations such as these to work to counter democratic backsliding?
These organizations that you have mentioned, ASEAN, BIMSTEC, or for that matter, SAARC. SAARC, I think, is a moribund organization. It might have actually died. We didn't know. Possibly we should write the obituary as soon as practically possible because it hasn't achieved anything. I know it's a very harsh indictment of SAARC. BIMSTEC and ASEAN has not been lived up to our expectation. But if you look at this organization structure and the mission, never ever has the democracy or the issues like that had been included. Hence, I don't think they have done anything. Lately, the ASEAN has been a little bit of a proactive with respect to Myanmar, for example. And particularly if you're looking at the region, South Asia per se, these organizations, either they have to refocus, and likelihood of that is, I think, not actually very promising because of the mission statements and the structure that they have developed. Going forward, this has to be, from the other part of the international community, and the regional ones. Regional ones will take years or decades to move. That's why I think more roles have to be played by, say, for example, the European community with respect to the region, because they have a huge investment, both human resources as well as political and economic. United States and others, that those needs to be more proactive with respect to halting this democratic backsliding and possibly reversing the course. I'm not very optimistic about this regional organization that you have mentioned. I wish I could be and I could provide you with a positive analysis or positive response.
Aarya, do you think private sector organizations can hold a multilateral association similar to the model of the World Economic Forum to bolster the demand for democracy and good governance in the Asia region?
It's certainly an idea worth exploring, but 2 points. First, such initiatives at the regional level require significant investment in the right incentives for participation. So maybe it would be better to consider, in addition to multilateral, multi-stakeholder initiatives as well, so that there's opportunity for businesses to join existing platforms, save costs, and there's also opportunity to engage across sector. But also on the private sector, I think the concept of private sector-driven democracy work is still new. And in many countries, and I know this through our work at CIPE, it's still a fight to get private sector a seat on the table and a voice in decision-making. And so I think there's not yet a consensus there on what should the role of private sector in democracy space look like, and where and in what shape the private sector themselves should be as far as their internal governance, ethics, and compliance standards are concerned, in order for them to be able to shoulder such an important responsibility at the regional level. So I think one way to perhaps begin thinking about this is to enable the private sector to join existing structures, improve on those, while having opportunities to consistently engage with democracy initiatives, all in the service of setting precedents, beginning to lead by example at the national level, and prepare for regional initiatives.
Okay. There is a common adage among politicians and policymakers in Bangladesh that prepared democracy cannot occur in the absence of adequate social and economic development. Do you believe this adage to be true? What has the experience been from the perspective of a region regarding the tug of war between ensuring economic development and maintaining the democratic rights of the people? Dr. Riaz, is 30 seconds, 45 seconds maximum.
It's a false dichotomy. It has been created to justify, legitimize authoritarianism, period. Because there has been no conclusive evidence to suggest that economic development brings democracy, or for that matter, for democracy, you will have to shun the development. Or the vice versa. So I think it's a false dichotomy that has been created by the authoritarian regimes to justify. We have seen that one in case of, in a possibly most vivid demonstration is China. But more importantly, this kind of conversation shifts the focus from what is needed. And without an inclusive, accountable system, even the development, quote-unquote development, mostly infrastructure development, remains weak and fragile. So I think this is created as a false dichotomy. There is no need for having this kind of conversation that practically legitimize the actions by those who are opposed to inclusive system. Hence, I'm very. I understand that in academic debate we can, but at the policy-making circuit, this should be completely ignored, because this is not what is going to achieve anything whatsoever.
Akash, in 30 seconds.
Well, I mean, to be very honest, after hearing, Dr. Riaz, I don't have, much to add on that. I think I totally, second this.
Thank you so much. So kind of you. Dr. Vaqar.
Yes, I think I agree with Dr. Riaz, but just one footnote that more than economic development, I think it would be the rule of law and minimum standards of rule of law, which can really allow the marginalized voices to participate in democratic processes.
Nishan.
I think this is said in relation, Zilur, to thinking that the poor vote on the basis of patronage politics, because you can basically, that food is the most important thing for the poor, not democratic structures or governance. But it misunderstands two very important things. One, that the best way to solve the problems of the poor, it turns out, is actually by allowing democratic processes to work better. That is what Amartya Sen's book and thesis on famine, for which he won the Nobel Prize, demonstrates that in democracies we don't have famine. And democracy is the antidote to the problems of poor in a very seriously understood way. And second, it misunderstands the way in which capitalists, or what we call crony capitalism, can actually become a form of subverting democracy, that wealth and riches don't make people committed to democracy. It can make them committed to controlling your politicians as well.
Aarya, by what process can private sector initiatives safeguard from democratic backsliding while still ensuring that economic growth and development is not hampered?
In the interest of time, I'll be very Zalor. I think, as I mentioned, private sector has to do some work on its internal governance and on its internal ethics and compliance standards in order to lead by example. Just to be brief, I think a priority for the private sector should be strengthening its ethics, compliance standards and internal governance to be inclusive and democratic, to set example, and then try and lead in this field.
Okay. And we are almost at the end of the program. So my last question is for all the panelists. What are your expectations and hopes from the upcoming Summit for Democracy, and what role can external actors, other countries or international organizations play in supporting democracy in South Asia? We'll begin with Akash and then go to Dr. Riaz, Dr. Vaqar, Nishan, and last we'll hear from Aarya. Mr. Akash, very briefly and precisely, maximum 45 seconds.
Okay, then I'll only make one point. I think, ideas are really important, whether they be in support of democracy or, anti-democratic sentiment carrying type. And, as defenders of democracy and freedom of expression, we should, acknowledge the fact that the only way to, counter that is through more, stronger, and good speech. And this is definitely somewhere where, the leaders of the world can come together, should come together. And I think, that's one of the expectations.
Dr. Ali Riaz.
My expectation with respect to this Democracy Summit is that participants, particularly who has influence over the global politics and institutions, make a very clear commitment that their talks and their actions would be aligned instead, both at home and externally, particularly when it comes down to the economic policies that should not simply bypass the commitment to democracy, because economy matters, but at the same time, it is absolutely necessary to be on the path to democracy and supporting democracy. I hope that alignment would be there and the commitment would continue. That's what I expect from the Democracy Summit.
Dr. Vaqar.
Yes, thank you. I think where South Asia stands today, it really needs to be more active at the global governance forums. And it has relevance for whatever is being discussed in G8, G20, who in turn also need to be responsive to this region's needs. And I think when it comes to global development community, they really need to invest more in the indigenous thought community. We have seen in the past that the funding from the north to local think tanks has been on a decline since the last decade. And we would really like to see local think tanks from the south connect with media outfits in the north who can amplify voices and messages of the marginalized. Thanks.
Nishan.
Thank you, Zilur. I think, there's a very important global problem to be solved for democracy, and it relates to the media. because the toxic politics that is emerging in South Asia, elsewhere in the world, that is undermining democracy, is also supported by the toxicity of the public conversation, which comes out of the way in which modern media is functioning to polarize societies, to take forward, hate speech, to undermine the need for listening, which is so vital for a public conversation to be democratic. And I think these are a global problem that requires some deep deliberation. We have large corporations that now control the conversation of society, the global society, in a very significant way. It is not democratized. But we also have, the traditional trusted media no longer functioning with the ability to gain the trust of people, and therefore creating mass confusion with regard to what is true, what is happening. And I think if we don't pay attention to solving this problem of the media in the modern world, which is significantly transformed itself from the time in which it was seen as the fourth estate of democracy, then democracy is in trouble not only in South Asia, but all over the world.
Aarya.
Just 2 points. I think it would be interesting to watch the commitments to action that will be made this December, because this is the first of the 2 summits. And second, I hope that this collective reflection will lead to a set of SMART goals, concrete and specific in nature, as opposed to general policy statements. So those would be my 2 main expectations.
Indeed, this was a fascinating discussion. Thank you so much, Dr. Ali Riaz, Mr. Nishan De Mel, Mr. Akash Shrestha, Dr. Vaqar Ahmed, and Ms. Aarya Nijat. Thank you for being with us. Dear viewers, this marks the end of our 4-part of special program. President Biden will host a virtual summit for leaders from government, public society, and the private sector on December 9 and 10, 2021. The summit will concentrate on the challenges and possibilities that democracies face, and it will give a forum for leaders to make individual and collective commitments to safeguard democracy and human rights, both in the USA and abroad. The Biden administration has committed to making democratic assistance a priority in US foreign policy, increasing expectations for a more proactive American involvement in reversing the worldwide democratic decline. It is, however, unfortunate that Bangladesh didn't get an invitation to join this dialogue on democracy. Perhaps this is a clear indication from our partners from the West that the condition of democracy in Bangladesh is not up to the mark. Bangladesh is still classified as a hybrid regime to the world. There are indications of weak democratic institutions, unfair elections, and a lack of separation of power between political parties and the state. The question now is, if promises are being made at the summit regarding the West's involvement in assisting in democratic development, will the effects of these promises go beyond the guest list and reach the people where democratic development is required the most? Thank you, viewers. Thank you for joining with us.